I'm really excited to be talking to all of you today because what I want to get into is what I think is one of the most important aspects of narcissism, which is how do they function in relationships? So let's start off. The main goal in relationships is this omnipotent way of relating. The main structure of the narcissist is the grandiose sense of self. In other words, the omnipotent, grandiose structure that develops within these individuals is really, in my opinion, what differentiates them from other personality disorders, such as the borderline personality disorder. They always have the grandiose sense of self, the omnipotent self to fall back on. But it's really important that we understand, how does this omnipotent sense of self play out in terms of relationships? So let's get right into that with a few examples. A fellow comes in and he tells me that he's very upset with his wife. And as I start exploring the details of what happened, he tells me that he was working on a home improvement project and he got stuck and he was beginning to feel frustrated. He turned to his wife with some complaints about the nature of the project, and after giving it some consideration, she made a suggestion in terms of how he can move the project along. It was at this point that they got into this really intense fight. And he told me that he told her, mind your own business. Why don't you talk to me about things that you know what you're talking about? Clearly, you don't know anything about this project. But overall, I think you get the sense that he was talking to her in a very demeaning and devaluing way. Okay, so that's example number one. Example number two. A woman tells me that she went away on a weekend trip with her husband and she barely survived. In other words, it was so unpleasant that she barely got through the trip. Again, when I started to get closer to her experience and I listened to the details, she described having quite a nice time over the weekend. In fact, she even mentioned, she alluded to this very briefly, that she wished that the weekend wasn't coming to an end. But her main focus was on the ride home and how her husband was really being distant and cold, and she couldn't understand why he was behaving this way. And before you knew it, they were in a really intense fight. She was calling him stupid and an idiot, and then subsequently it ended up that they were getting a divorce. So you see how things escalated quite quickly. Looking at the social media content, what I discovered is something, again, that I'm sure you're all familiar with, is what we call love bombing, right? Love bombing is what? Love bombing, in psychoanalytic terms, is the creation of an idealized relationship where everything is perfect, right? So the love bombing phase of the relationship, it's sort of when one is infatuated with the other, when you can only see all the wonderful qualities and you overlook anything that's negative. And as you can imagine, this is a really blissful, wonderful, magical time. And just to, again, remind you of a little bit of the psychoanalytic theory, this is what Margaret Mahler has referred to as the symbiotic phase, or what other analysts have called the narcissistic stage, right? That's the early stage of development where there's this blissful sort of contentment. So that's stage one. And then, again, according to the content that I reviewed, what often happens is they enter into stage two, which is the devaluation state. And then the omnipotence, or the wonderful, blissful experience of togetherness, is broken, and they begin to devalue the other. After so much of this devaluing occurs, the other eventually leaves them. At that point, they could, feel like they've been victimized in some way. The point is, there's some sort of break here. And then that begins with what's sometimes referred to as the hoovering stage, right? And that just simply means it's an attempt, again, more or less through like the love bombing, the gestures of love, and I miss you, and we could work things out, and I want to be with you, excessive texting or calling, wanting to spend all the time together. So the hoovering is to get them back. To get them back to what? To that blissful state of union, right? So this blissful state of union in psychoanalytic terms is what we call the omnipotent narcissistic object relationship, when everything is magically wonderful. Okay, so what we have to think about next is, what happens that they move from this really blissful, wonderful stage or state of mind to the devaluing? And again, if you look at the social media content, the explanation looks something like this, that they tend to get bored, right? They get bored of the narcissistic supplies that they're receiving. When I heard that, I thought, that could be possible. In other words, it's possible that one gets bored with the narcissistic supplies, and then they turn to the devaluing stage, or they could get the supplies somewhere else. But what I also said to myself is, I think we need a better understanding of this, because I don't think it fully explains why one moves from this magical state to the devaluing state. Because, let me just give you an example. How does one suddenly get bored? In other words, the narcissistic supplies were working just fine yesterday. Why are they not working today? And why did they get bored today? Why did they not get bored yesterday? Or tomorrow, for instance? Why not get bored tomorrow? So you see what I'm hinting at, and it's been my experience in working with many, many individuals like this, that something happens to shift it from one stage of the relationship dynamic into the next. So what is it that happens? That's what we need to think about. And what I like to do now is expand the theory of they just get bored. And like I said, there is some truth to this, but in my experience, the narcissist doesn't just get bored. Typically you see this more in the borderline patients, or maybe it's the more disturbed narcissistic patients towards the end of the spectrum, more towards the borderline level, who need a certain amount of chaos. Not consciously. If you spoke to them about this, they would say, of course I don't want chaos in my relationship. She just or he just does this to me all the time, and they always start a fight with me, and they're picking on me, etc. I think you get the point. Now, we just need to go a little bit further back in childhood and pull again on psychoanalytic theory to explain this shift. When things go accordingly, remember, the developing child has a sense that the caregiver is there for them. And I've described this in other episodes, that what happens with the narcissistic individual is that there's this feeling that the caregiver is not sufficiently attuned to them. And there are many childhood experiences where they are either overly frustrated or overly gratified. That's possible as well. And there are prolonged absences, separations, right? They're too long. And what happens when there are too many and too long frustrations or separations, the developing baby child begins to develop an experience that the caregiver is withholding from them. There's this old saying in my field that there's no such thing as an absent caregiver, there's only a bad caregiver. So the baby feels and begins to believe that somebody is withholding something from them, that person is mean, right? And now if they think the other person is mean, that they have something they could give but they're just not giving it, they become increasingly frustrated, and this begins to lead to something that I haven't really spoken about too much earlier, because earlier I said it can lead to a sense of worthlessness, or they feel like they're not valued, they feel like they're not important, which of course are all characteristics of the narcissist. But the part that I did not emphasize yet until just now is a destructive quality. In other words, they get angry. And one way they demonstrate their anger is to turn away. So in other words, if the caregiver is trying to give them a feed, a reparative feed, or to be there or give them something loving, they turn away. This is the baby who turns away and can't accept the comforting nurturance that's given. And by the way, they have to eat, of course. But eating, and I'm speaking about this on a symbolic level, but eating and receiving a comforting meal is very different, because a baby can eat for survival, but that doesn't mean that the baby is feeling comforted and loved. Okay, so now what we have is this picture of not just a sense of shame or worthlessness that begins to develop, but also a sense of anger, right? And destructiveness. And now they want to there's an attempt to destroy any loving efforts that are made. And this is the example I gave you, by the way. So think again about the woman that I mentioned who's returning home from this trip with her husband. This was a loving weekend away that she said she wanted more of it, but she could not accept that for some reason. So at the end, when we spoke about this, she began to realize that she herself brought up a sensitive conversation. And, initially it was all just he's picking on me or he's in a bad mood. But when you look at these things really closely, what we began to see is she was actually quite provocative without even realizing it. But that's not the main point. The main point is, why did she need to destroy such a loving, comforting weekend that she wanted more of? Now, there's a lot more to be said about this, but we have to stop there for today. Until next time, see you then.